British men plead guilty to terrorism offences at the Old Bailey.
Before I was practicing, I used to be in the police.
One of them is a former police community support officer. Another is a Muslim convert from Dorset. All three were accused of travelling to Pakistan for terror training. Their preacher denies radicalising them.
I tell them definitely about the foreign policy and what Islam says about that. But that does not mean that we're training anyone. We're not sending anyone abroad to fight. We don't have any kind of military colleges where people are learning how to make bombs.
Also on tonight's programme, protecting the victims of press intrusion, the coalition publishes rival proposals on regulation. England's primary schools under pressure. Nearly 250,000 new places will be needed in just 18 months' time. The 14th century burial site for the victims of the plague uncovered by workers digging a rail link across London.
I'm going to shave my head. Whatevs, no biggie, totally.
I shall ruin an episode of Call the Midwife.
And the stars come out for comic relief as it celebrates 25 years of being funny for money.
And coming up in Sports Day at 6:30 on the BBC News Channel, the favourite Bobsworth wins jump racing's most prestigious prize, the Cheltenham Gold Cup.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. 3 British men have pleaded guilty to preparing for acts of terrorism. One of the men used to be a police community support officer, and another, the son of teachers in Dorset, was a recent convert to Islam when the offences took place. As our Home Affairs correspondent Matt Prodger now reports, the case has raised further concerns about the radicalisation of young Muslims.
I used to be in the police, Metropolitan Police.
This is Jahangir Alam, once a police community support officer, now a convicted terrorist. Today he admitted preparing for acts of terrorism by travelling to Pakistan for training.
They say salam alaikum, which means peace be upon you.
His co-defendant was Richard Dart, a white Muslim convert. He too pleaded guilty. They were arrested in police raids last July. The door to Alam's house was blown off its hinges. He lived in the shadow of the Olympic Park in East London and was taken into custody weeks before the Games.
These men were unlikely would-be terrorists. One of them used to help police the streets of London, and the other is from a seaside town in Dorset. Ordinary men seduced by a dangerous ideology.
You foolish people risk your life for these degenerate rulers.
Richard Dart's path to extremism was captured on camera 2 years ago by his own stepbrother. It became a BBC documentary which tried to make sense of how a young man from Weymouth became a radical Muslim by the name of Salahuddin.
There is no one worthy of worship.
It showed Dart being converted to Islam by Anjem Chowdhury, a notorious extremist preacher whose various Islamic groups have in the past been banned by the government. It's not known who pushed Richard Dart towards terrorism, but Anjem Chowdhury says it wasn't him.
I have a responsibility towards my Muslim, brothers and sisters, but that does not mean that we're training anyone. We're not sending anyone abroad to fight. We don't have any kind of military colleges where people are learning how to make bombs. You know, if someone is doing anything like that, and I don't think that these individuals, Salahuddin and Jahangir, are, by the way, then they're doing it, behind the scenes.
Evidence showed the defendants discussed targeting Wootton Bassett, the Wiltshire town where residents paid their respects to returning soldiers. But there was no word of that in court today. A third defendant, Imran Mahmood, spent a year in Pakistan and is thought to have fought in Afghanistan. But the full details of what these men planned won't emerge until sentencing next month. Matt Prodger, BBC News.
The Prime Minister and his deputy, Nick Clegg, have unveiled opposing plans for press regulation following the Leveson inquiry. Both propose a royal charter underpinning an independent regulator. But crucially, the plans set out jointly by Nick Clegg and the Labour leader Ed Miliband would be backed by law. The House of Commons will vote on the issue on Monday. Our political correspondent Ross Hawkins reports.
When they heard what happened to the victims of press intrusion, all 3 party leaders agreed things needed to change, but they couldn't agree how. So now David Cameron finds himself split from his coalition partner, with Nick Clegg. Conservatives were on their own when they presented their plan for a royal charter for press regulation. Papers would pay extra damages in court cases if they hadn't signed up to the regulator. There'd be a risk of huge fines, up to £1 million, if they broke a new press code, but there'd be no law to stop ministers. That wasn't enough for the parents of missing Madeleine McCann, who endured excruciating stories, falsely claiming that they were responsible for her death.
I think it's been disingenuous, some of the rhetoric that's been coming from the Conservatives. Freedom of speech. You know, let's be absolutely clear about this. Lord Leveson says that for the first time, if his principles were put into place, that freedom of speech would be underpinned for the press.
He said that he'd support the plans Labour and the Lib Dems set out today. Their royal charter would be backed by a law to stop ministers changing it in the future. It would make sure newspapers couldn't veto appointments to the new regulator and would force the press to print prominent apologies when they made mistakes.
The proposal we're putting forward is true to the principles that all the party leaders set out 20 months ago when we heard the scandal around the Dowlers, for example, and the hacking of Millie Dowler's phone, which said we want to put the victims first.
On this issue, David Cameron and I have always been open about the fact that we have our differences. When the Leveson report was published, we gave 2 separate statements to the House of Commons. It's not usual that, but it happens from time to time.
Morning. And in Brussels, the Prime Minister faced questions about which way this government's press policy would finally turn.
We are bringing this issue to a conclusion. What I think we can't go on with is a situation where the victims and the public don't know what sort of press regulation we're going to have. That needs to change.
Should Westminster politicians fail to make those changes, the Scottish Government could push on with separate plans. It all means that after months of inquiry, hearings and political talks, the press, the politicians and even the Prime Minister endured excruciating stories until the vote here on Monday what the future for the newspapers might hold. Ross Hawkins, BBC News at Westminster.
250,000 primary school places in England will be needed by September next year. The National Audit Office says schools in England are struggling to cope with a surge in numbers. 1 in 5 primary schools is already full or near capacity, despite the creation of tens of thousands of extra places. Our education correspondent Rita Chakrabarti is here.
Endured excruciating stories.
Well, today's figures are striking. In the last decade, England's had its biggest birth rate boom since the 1950s, and it means hundreds of thousands of new places will be needed over the next few years.
That is a strange dream.
Red Nose Day at this primary school in Reading, but school places are no laughing matter. The council is spending £25 million for new places throughout the borough, but will still be short. This school has got 60 new places, housed in this prefab in the playground. Parents understand the need, but question how big the school will get.
They're having to build new classrooms every year to accommodate for the new children coming in. There's more and more children obviously moving into the area, and more houses being built, and just not the schools.
It's not fair on our children because we've, bought houses in an area.
Yeah. It's not, if they build a school and it gets bigger, it's great. I'm sure there's lots of large outstanding schools in the area, but it's our kids here today that are actually going to be negatively impacted by this.
The shortage of places is concentrated in certain areas of England. Those in orange are under pressure, with estimated shortfalls of up to 5%. Those in red are worse, with shortfalls of over 5%. And London is the hardest hit. What are the reasons? Well, they'll vary from area to area, but they include a 6% increase in the number of childbearing women since 2003. That could be to do with migration, and partly, according to the report, with older mothers who postponed having children in the 1990s to the 2000s.
What do they really like chasing?
Who's to blame? Today's report said the government is providing money for more places, but it needs a better understanding of the costs and the impact of its spending on the ground. Ministers accuse the previous Labour government of cutting primary places and say they're spending £5 billion to put things right.
When we came in, I'm afraid that the money that was there for school buildings was not being used to create new school buildings. It was being used for repair, and that's important. But the really pressing need for new school buildings is something that we've prioritised.
Mr Gove was in Leicester today visiting a free school. Labour say this government has focused too much on free schools set up by parents or teachers